Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Charivag, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss the module titled Place of Agrarian Labour Part 2. This module is part of the paper titled Agrarian Social Relations and Social Structure in India. This paper is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur of IIM Kolkata. In this module titled Place of Agrarian Labour Part 2, we are going to focus on agrarian and social structure in terms of present day times. Further, we are also going to look at caste and land based hierarchy that is present within the agrarian labor structure. Further, we are also going to look into the implications of growing mechanization of agriculture that has an impact on agrarian labor in India. Place of agrarian labor 2. In this module, we will take you through the intricate social world that the agrarian labor inhabits. In general, there is a symmetry between the social hierarchy and the agrarian hierarchy. This means that those who are at the bottom of the land-based stratification are also the ones who come from low caste groups. Conversely, landowners are usually from the high caste groups, and you will not find it surprising at all that the members of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe are disproportionately represented among the ranks of agrarian labor. This module builds up on the earlier module 4.3a and gives you an overall exposure to the messy nexus between caste and labor in the Indian countryside. We will also talk about the consequences of labor displacing technology such as tractors, harvesters, threshers, etc. We will try to assess the benefits occurring from the adoption of modern technology in agriculture from the vantage point of the agrarian labor. We will speculate on the future of the agrarian labor in the new agricultural economy. Caste and labor relations. Social stratification is omnipresent in all societies. In India, the most perceptible form of social stratification has been on caste. Caste fixes and sanctions the obligations and privileges of its members by birth. Caste system in rural economies is more pronounced than their urban counterparts. Conventionally, some of the members of the category of agrarian labor would be bonded agrarian laborers. They would be tied to a certain landowning households across generations. Now, the practice of bonded labor is legally banned, even as informal forms of bondage may persist in different parts of the country. In general, socioeconomy would operate in such a way that those in the lower echelons of society would never get an opportunity to rise in hierarchy. The socioeconomic structure would support this by the force of convention and one's acquisition to one's place in the hierarchy. An important dimension of the social system was the linkage of labor division with particular social categories. Hereditary occupation plays a pivotal role as these identities were inherited from one generation to another. The choice of occupation was not unrestricted. For instance, most of the lower caste groups belonging to the so-called Shudras category and the untouchables were traditionally involved in doing menial jobs. The social structure was such that there was no question of exercising choice in matters of occupation. Even if an individual was interested and inclined towards some other vocation, society did not permit it by erecting normative structural barriers against any such movement. There was very little permissible structural space for what we called upward social mobility. It may not have been totally absent, but the rural social structure, of which the agrarian structure was a part, admitted very little of this possibility. Even now, caste identities play an essential role in determining the extent and the level of loyalty on the part of the laborer. The rural agrarian structure is of considerable significance. It is this agrarian structure that socializes the lower classes and laborers into submitting themselves completely to their masters. Agrarian economy provides them with social security, but in the urban setting it might be absent in traditional form. Nevertheless, the laborers show no signs of transforming their attitudes and social relations. They tend to be overcommitted if they get secure employment with acceptable wages. Ostensibly, they view their jobs in the same way as they viewed their traditional caste occupations, where the specialist, the worker in this case, serves the patron, the industrialist. Bhomik affirms Lambert and conjectures that traditional agrarian culture was consistent with industrialization. Even in contemporary agrarian structure, caste is not unrelated to functional or occupational differentiation. In agrarian context, menial jobs requiring intense physical labor are mostly done by members of the lower caste group. These people do not have the ownership of the land they labor upon. As technological advances have been made agricultural production much less labor-intensive, agrarian labor is displaced from its traditional role. These laborers are forced to seek non-farm employment, which is low-paying and irregular. Superficially, it might seem that caste-based stratification is a predominantly rural characteristic. Industrialization, which is another facet of modernization along technological lines, can be expected to be caste-neutral. Once an agrarian laborer free herself and himself from agrarian bondage, his or her caste identity would dilute and upward mobility would become feasible. Nonetheless, the real situation of footloose labor is strikingly different. In fact, Cornell et al. Posit that migration starts from a situation of inequality at the point of departure and leads to further inequality at the point of destination. Migration from conventional and overprotective rural society to a city requires physical and social capital assets besides education and training. It is unfortunate that a majority of the subaltern classes from villages are unequipped in these regards, which makes it difficult for them to get regularized shelter and work in the urban neighborhood. To put it differently, industrialization and the subsequent urbanization do not have direct impact on caste-based agrarian rural structure. Technically, industrial employment of labor does not discriminate on the basis of caste, but effectively it does. Industrialization breaks away from the traditional hierarchy of rural agrarian structure and allows occupational mobility to a certain extent. Identities such as caste, ethnicity, or gender are to be seen as constitutive of the very structure of the working class and not merely external cultural identities or ideologies. Migration of labor from agriculture to industry has been a common feature since the inception of industrialization. However, it should be noted that a majority of those who migrate as labor do not have land ownership. The income increases but not substantially. Earlier, mostly the male folk would migrate in groups and live in clusters around industry. But now, even female members of the family migrate along with male laborers. This new setup has a new set of problems. On the one hand, migration from agrarian labor to industrial labor allows them occupational mobility, but on the other hand, the nature of this migration is such that caste identities become most pronounced. Mostly individuals of the same caste migrates in group in urban areas. They get asylum in their own caste-dominated areas. Consequently, caste identity emerges with class identity. Individual sector is devoid of perpetual bondage, but it also tends to consider various types of poorly paid, unorganized and unskilled labor as substitute. Laborers are treated as commodities and hired as per need. On fulfillment of requirement, there is lack of any form of commitment from the employer to provide the laborer with subsistence, wages or even work. Indebtedness towards urban money lenders is like gold-edged sword for footloose laborers. If moneylender happens to be a contractor cum employer, the laborer who is so acclimatized to lifetime commitment and loyalty in the villages tries to imitate similar behavior even in the cities. This is uncalled for, but the laborer does it out of habit. He is socialized into believing that master should be served at all costs. This can be voluntary on part of the laborer. However, commitment and bondage can also be obligatory. Often the money-lending employer does not allow the laborers to work for other employers who may provide them better wages and work conditions. Advance payment is a tool used to tame the footloose laborers. To understand the trajectory of footloose laborers, we have to understand the financial and economic situation in which the laborers migrate. They are in a pauperized condition in their hometown and in dire need of money. It could be either a disease, marriage, or a natural calamity that requires them to borrow money. Laborers borrow money to meet the contingency and then migrate to pay back the debt. In such a situation, it is often the employer who lends them in form of advance payment. In lieu of advance payment, the laborer has to accept low wages, stringent work conditions, and restrictive conditions which erodes their resistance powers. The agrarian laborers upon migration are incapacitated and are forced to respond at the beck and call of employers or his agents. A prominent role is played by the middleman who provides employment opportunities. Owing to limited employment and the distribution of opportunities is skewed across various social groups. The newcomers from hinterland do not have extensive social networks in the urban areas which can provide them employment opportunities on arrival. Usually, the early migrants from a particular caste bring their relatives and friends and help them settle in a new society. Breman argues that caste and faith operate as signposts in seeking and finding work. Entitlement to favors, protection, and support in the event of misfortune are also challenged along these lines. As the middlemen have an advantage of being the first movers, they also play the role of creditor to the migrants. The roots of kinship between creditor and laborer can be traced back to either the same village or same caste. For the help, extended financial or otherwise, by the members of the same caste, the group, the laborer becomes indebted to the new creditor or the employer. The caste-based division of labor also contributes to the urban economy. It is usually the lower caste members who are involved in executing tasks which are physically more strenuous. Caste identities plays an important role. As discussed earlier, people migrating from the same village tend to bring in their kin and friends. This leads to the creation of a new community based on caste, albeit in an urban space. Sharma poses the general conclusion seems to be that in the caste composition of the workforce broadly reflects that of the urban population as a whole, though the middle and the higher caste are overrepresented in the higher echelons of industrial work hierarchy, while the bottom ranks have high concentration of low caste workers, a correlation which is strongly affected by differences in the educational levels. Consequently, also due to lack of other alternatives, the indebted laborer has no option but to work for whatever wage that is offered to him by the creditor or employer. The mechanism of bonding the labor is similar to the agrarian structure. This bonding also gets institutionalized, although in a different manner. The employer has no obligations towards the laborer whatsoever, and the laborer has no sense of security either of subsistence or of employment. It is for these reasons that Breman chooses to call it neo-bondage. However, unlike industrial laborers, landless laborers are not accustomed to function within framework which stress collective aims. Neo-bondage is evolved form of classical bonded labor. The nature of work is different from agriculture, but the nature of employment is similar. In an agrarian system, there are seasonal contracts for farming, while in industry there are casual laborers. In both the cases, distorted power structure between the employer and the laborer is retained. Unequal dependencies give rise to suboptimal working conditions and lower than minimum wages. Neo-bondage thus arises from and gives rise to stringent, unfavorable economic conditions. Caste alone is not to be blamed for the prevalence of exploitative neo-bondage system. It is a complex interplay of technology, caste, gender, and land that shape the place of agrarian labor in the contemporary Indian economy. As the growth of industry is not proportionate with the population growth, the sources of existence are under pressure, and the people are likely to fall back on familiar social mechanisms and make use of them to exert influence and to promote their own interests. This discrimination is similar in nature to the caste discrimination faced by agrarian laborers in rural areas. Though coming from different sources, the nature and form of discrimination are the same. Mobility and restricted choice cause laborers to lead a life of dependency and marginalization. Urban sector in a way discriminates highly between formal and informal sector. It is not very often that a high caste person becomes marginalized laborer in the urban area. More often than not, it is the low caste people who continue to face marginalization and exclusion in urban areas post-migration. Ties of debt which bind the rural laborer to his master in villages are present in the urban sector also. The moneylender could be the one who sponsored the migration of laborer in search of greener pastures, or it could be the middleman who helped the newly arrived laborer. It could also be the contractor cum employer who has given advance payment to the laborer. Moneylender could be of any form, but ties of indebtedness continue to loom large over the laborers. Processes such as privatization, mechanization, industrialization crush the already marginalized and excluded communities of rural landless laborers and tribals. Often the discourse on the rural laborers does not consider the tribals. Historically, tribals have been living in association with village and peasant agriculture. The association has been not regular or based on community linkages the way to adjacent villages are. It was a common practice for the tribals to come to the neighboring villages to sell their produce and the products like lac, honey, herbs, and other medicinal plants. The disruption in agrarian structure due to the advent of industrialization has adverse effects on tribal life. As more and more land is being acquired for setting up industries or for building roads and housing for urban dwellers, the tribals are getting uprooted. Tribals have always been in close contact with the land for their life and survival. Exploitation of laborers includes low-caste rural laborers, tribals, and especially high proportion of tribal women are a worrisome trend in our times. Technology and labor relations. Technological innovation advances the displacement of labor. With the advent of industrialization, the rural labor, which was essentially agrarian labor, has become mobile over long distances. This large-scale migration is further catalyzed by the mechanization of agriculture. The demand for labor in agriculture is decreasing consistently as more efficient machines are being used for jobs which were earlier done manually. As a result, more and more agrarian labor is being pushed out of the agrarian sector and they add to the pool of footloose labor. This is evident that most of the footloose labor come from more humble backgrounds, many being employed as agricultural laborers in the surrounding villages before they join the footloose army of industrial workers in the urban informal economy. The footloose labor is characterized by the casualization of labor. They migrate to and fro from rural to urban sector and from farm to non-farm jobs. Informality becomes an asset as they can be hired and fired as per as convenience of the employer. This is not restricted to rural areas. Informality tends to become overarching structure of the global market in general. Problems that Indian agrarian labor faces are manifold. Labor is freely available and there is fierce competition for work. Competition is enhanced by the enlargement of scale so that labor comes into the market at prices far below the subsistence level. Industries are established but they do not fully absorb the surplus agricultural labor. As a result, the labor is forced to remain in agricultural sector. This surplus labor does not add to the marginal productivity of agriculture and makes it inefficient. Once a traditional landowner-laborer relationship ruptures due to the plethora of reasons mentioned earlier, the footloose labor are treated as a huge reserve pool of labor that can be recruited and laid out in accordance with the fluctuating tide of economic activity. Technological innovations promote development in agriculture as well as industry. However, it is equally true that technology does not benefit all segments of society equally. If technology brings in efficiency on one hand, it also displaces a large number of manual laborers on the other hand. It is for this reason that Gandhi was against industrialization as a paradigm for development. It was industrialization that was causing large-scale unemployment in India. It displaced laborers from the traditional roles, and these unskilled and semi-skilled laborers could not be absorbed in the industrial sector for several reasons discussed elsewhere in this paper. Even those laborers who are employed in the industry have limited contact with technology and machines. Their role in the industrial sector continues to be menial in nature. Breman poses that in industries at the bottom is a colossal army of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. These industries lack almost any advanced technology and have far less attractive working conditions. Green Revolution is an example of a type of technological advantage which was limited to the class of big farmers and substantial landowners. Green Revolution did impact the agricultural sector positively in terms of productivity growth, but its gains occurred differentially to different segments of agricultural produce. Dhanagre argues that the accessibility of Green Revolution technology was constrained in the hands of few farmers who could afford it. As consequence, the prosperity unleashed by the Green Revolution was distributed differentially to different categories of farmers, putting the small and marginal farmers at a relative disadvantage. Any technological upgradation requires a considerable amount of capital. Only big farmers can afford such luxury of buying expensive machines and technologies. Also, there is a vested interest of the capitalists to bring in agriculture in their arena to market-driven operation. They use technology as a vehicle to introduce capitalism in the agricultural sector. There have been many instances of contract farming which essentially promote capitalist growth in agriculture. Apparently, technology does not exclude anybody. It is freely available to all who can afford it. In traditional societies, occupational choices were highly restricted, even if a person wished to change his or her profession. Technology propounds symmetric competition. The element of exclusion is introduced not at the access point but at the affordability point. All technological innovations are highly capital intensive. All farmers have to borrow money from money lenders or banks to acquire capital intensive farm machinery and other productive resources. Traditional money lending has its vices of its own. They charge interest rate which is higher than the market rates. Often the collateral is dear to the farmer as it is usually his or her land title. As a small farmer rarely has any possession besides his or her land. Using the paltry possession as a collateral for something as ambiguous as new technology might further the poverty of small farmers if it fails. Further, these small farmers seldom have access to formal lending agencies like bank or cooperative societies. Credit is the biggest hurdle these small farmers face in acquisition of new technology. There is considerable lag before small farmers acquire latest technology which the big producers are already taking advantage of. This can be exemplified with the high-cost, high-yield cereal technology of the Green Revolution, which required substantial capital investments which were generally beyond the means of a majority of small and marginal farmers. Job generation of the kind witnessed by the Indian economy does not match with the skill profile of the bulk of available labor, thereby forcing people to remain in agriculture for much longer than they would care, and in turn increasing both rural underemployment and unemployment. The predominant growth of service sector vis-a-vis manufacturing adds to general lack of employability of the agrarian labor. Rural non-agrarian growth leads to generation of non-farm jobs and migration thereof. As the levels of skill attainment are considerably lower among poor, this shift leads to further impoverishment as they do not command decent wages even in the non-farm sector. In the developed countries, the pace of industrialization is greater, but it does not hamper the growth. The main reason for successful development experience can be attributed to a shift of labor from relatively low productivity agriculture to relatively higher productivity industry and services sectors. There is also a close link between industrialization and productivity, that is, rapid industrialization has been associated with rapid increases in productivity levels. Another important aspect of this shift of labor from agriculture sector to industrial sector is the exploitation that these laborers were subjected to by the agrarian landowners in the past. The bond between landowners and the laborers were more often than not bondage. Not only the agrarian laborers but his entire family, including the female and the children, would be tied to the landowner's household. And this bondage would be perpetual as it would extend beyond one generation. With the rise of colonial rulers came the opportunity to get education and transgress the caste inhibitions. Despite the extreme difficulties and hardships associated with much industrial work, workers still seem to be strongly prefer such work to the lowly paid agricultural work. Industrial sector was attractive for agrarian laborers as it did not come with a rider of bondage. There was freedom for laborers in the sector. They would be paid only if they worked, but they would not be dominated in an agrarian society. The agrarian regime of bonded labor was overthrown by technological modernization to an extent. In this sense, industrialization provided an escape route to the agrarian underclass. Drawing from his earlier work in 1996, Breman argues that the growing industrial sector widened and deepened the labor market, making it easier for the agrarian labor to leave the villages, and urban economy came within reach for many more people than before. Massive influx of displaced agrarian labor continues in the industrial sector. This aggravates the problem of unorganized and underprotected laborers. Urban economy did provide opportunities to rural migrants who lacked skills and social capital, but there is a limit to this absorption capacity. Unskilled laborers cannot rise up to the social hierarchy easily as employment opportunity for regular jobs is limited. This leads to a rise in the footloose labor. It is clear now that the formal sector is not able to accommodate the relentless influx of footloose contingents driven out of agrarian rural economy. Even after substantial mechanization of agriculture and the parallel industrialization, a considerable proportion of laborers are involved in casual work. This upholds the hypothesis that industrialization leads to casualization of labor. Quoting Breman, Srivastava has argued that there is a continued existence of a large mass of unorganized, unproductive workers about whom very little is known. There is little formal information about this category of laborers. For laborers who keep oscillating between rural and urban areas depending upon wages and employment availability, it is difficult to categorize them in any one category. These footloose laborers continue to struggle for their marginal existence as a reserve pool of labor. Oscillating between sectors and capacities, they acquire the status of being footloose. Technology in agriculture aids the betterment of the rich and the landed. Seldom has the advantage of technological innovation seeped down to the marginal farmers. Satyadeva poses that agricultural development through the application of the new scientific knowledge was just a euphemism for using the public sector to promote the private seed industry, in which the benefit of the new scientific knowledge went invariably to the upper caste rich rural farmers. It seldom reached poor tenants and low caste farmers who needed it most. The landless peasants or small farmers do not have access to the amount of capital required to acquire the latest technology. It is the landed farmers who get an access to technology, further deepening the divide between the large and the small farmers. Agrarian structure is a complex interaction of technology, economy and social stratification. The agrarian social structure is a crisscrossing patterns of relationship encompassing ethnicity, caste, religion, land ownership, village and kinship and family ties. As India is an agrarian country, the economic and social development is directly linked to the agrarian social structure, be it agrarian transformation, industrialization or globalization, all are accompanied by a change in the agrarian structure. Further, the agrarian structure impacts the life chances of the agrarian labor. Migration from rural to urban areas, from informal to formal sector, from farm to non-farm job is not divide of the essence of the agrarian structure. The ties of kinship and brotherhood established in the agrarian structure continue to be valid in urban settings and help the newly migrant laborer in finding foothold in the new establishment. As we have seen earlier, these ties of kinship also become a source of bondage for laborers who have escaped the agrarian bonded labor. We delved into this issue in detail and tried to understand how neo bondage is practiced in urban areas along the same lines as traditional bonding of labor in rural sector. We have also discussed about the importance of caste in Indian social structure. Caste identities plays an important role in determining the profession of people in rural life areas. However, these identities continue to shape economic and social interaction in urban areas as well. It is an undisputed fact that the membership of a certain caste, region, ethnic group, tribal unit or religious community is still an important factor in the search for employment in urban sector. As there is a certain continuity and certain change in social structure, it is evident from the rising of number of informal laborers in the urban areas that industry continues to attract agrarian laborers. They comprise both the male and the female workers. One reason can be the facade of freedom that attracts laborers. City life is more promising than the mundane rural life. Another major factor is economic. There is enormous discrepancies in material conditions between agrarian and industrial sectors that ensures that migration remains an attractive proposition for a large proportion of informal laborers. In conclusion, students, what did this module inform us? In this module, we learned that there is an increase in the number of footloose labor. Drawing from the work of Breman, we have also looked into how there is a rise of contractual laborers in India, especially within the rural region, that are pushing into the urban informal economy of the Indian structure. Further, we have also looked into the specific problems of female, children and tribal footloose laborers in India, and further we have looked into the footloose laborers who form an internal part of the reserve army of the labor force. As mentioned above, become an important part of the informal economy of India. Thank you.